While the world focuses on conflict while headlines scream escalation, the United States, Israel, and Iran are fighting over the Strait of Hormuz, spending billions and billions of dollars. There's a country that hasn't fired a single shot, a country that is patiently watching, calculating, and yet silently winning this war and turning chaos into opportunity. Let's start with what actually happened, and why it matters that you understand it precisely. On April 18th, a fragile ceasefire agreement was reached. Iran agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Ships began to move, tanker captains exhaled, markets ticked upward, and then, within hours, Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Ghalibaf announced that the agreement was dead. The ships turned back. The graveyard returned. Here is the paradox that is now locked into place. Washington says the naval blockade stays until a nuclear deal is signed. Tehran says the strait stays closed until the naval blockade ends. Neither side blinks. And in between, tankers sit anchored, economies bleed slowly, and the world watches a standoff that neither party can afford to lose. And both parties refuse to end. In peacetime, approximately 135 ships per day transited this waterway. That number has dwindled to single digits, a collapse in global energy flows unlike anything since the 1970s. Beginning March 4th, 2026, Iranian forces declared the strait closed and began carrying out attacks on ships attempting transit. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre has logged over a dozen confirmed attacks. This is not posturing. The IRGC is running what can only be described as a parallel shadow toll system. One ship reportedly paid $2 million for passage through Iran's channel. And crucially, payments were assessed in Chinese yuan, not dollars. Yuan. Let that sit for a second. A radical Islamic government is effectively taxing international shipping in a currency issued by the Chinese Communist Party on a waterway that international law says no one country controls. That is not desperation. That is strategy. The White House has argued this crisis does not really hurt America. We produce more oil than we need, they say. We can weather this. That is simply not true. And here is why. Gasoline has jumped from $2.98 to $4.11 per gallon, a 38% increase in under 2 months. Fertilizer prices are up 40% year over year. About 1/3 of the world's fertilizer travels through the Strait of Hormuz. That fertilizer feeds the crops that stock your grocery store. The chain is direct, and it is already breaking. The IMF has cut its global growth forecast to 3.1% for 2026, with inflation now projected at 4.4% globally. For every $10 sustained increase in oil prices per barrel, GDP growth falls by roughly 0.4%. A sustained $60 increase above baseline, which is where we are heading, would push the United States into recession territory. America produces its own oil. America does not produce its own oil price. Now let's look at this from Tehran's perspective. Because the IRGC is not closing the strait out of desperation. They are closing it because closing it works. On paper, Iran's economy is collapsing, a projected contraction of 6.1%. The U.S. naval blockade has completely halted economic trade going into and out of Iran by sea, in a country where 90% of the economy runs on international trade. That is catastrophic by any normal measure. But Iran is not playing for GDP. They are playing for survival and for a seat at a table where, a year ago, they had no invitation. France and Italy are negotiating directly with Iran to allow their ships through. South Korea has sent special envoys to Iran, Kazakhstan, Oman, and Saudi Arabia to secure crude supplies. American allies are peeling away, one by one, to make bilateral deals with the country Washington is trying to isolate. Iran allowed passage to ships from China, Russia, India, Iraq, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Thailand, all after direct talks with Tehran. Every flag it grants access to is a diplomatic win. Every country that deals directly with Iran is, whether it means to or not, recognizing Iranian sovereignty over what is supposed to be an international waterway. The nuclear talks in Islamabad are the real battlefield now, and every day the strait stays closed, Iran's leverage at that table grows. If Iran is the match that lit this fire, China is the country warming its hands by the flame. China is hurting from the Hormuz blockade in the short term. The strait supplies roughly half of China's crude imports. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve provides an estimated 6-month buffer, but the clock started February 28th, 2026. So yes, China is being squeezed. And yes, China is also winning. Both things are true. Nations scrambling to escape fossil fuel dependence are accelerating renewable investment, and China manufactures the solar panels, the batteries, the electric vehicles, at scale, at low cost, on demand. The Gulf states that produce aluminum have had their exports shut down by the war. China produces about 60% of global aluminum. They will fill that gap. And then there is the yuan. Iran is accepting yuan for straight passage. Russia is settling crude trades in yuan. In the first quarter of 2026, 90% of Russia's total crude exports went to China and India. The dollar's grip on energy markets is not collapsing dramatically. It is loosening quietly, structurally, deal by deal. China could not have designed a better crisis if it had tried. The world is being slowly pushed into China's industrial arms, not by Chinese aggression, but by a war China had nothing to do with starting. And then there is Russia, the conflict's most straightforward profiteer. Moscow condemned the U.S.-Israeli strikes publicly. Lavrov gave the appropriate speeches, and then the oil price spiked. The world's desperate buyers turned to Moscow, and Russian asset prices rose. Sometimes geopolitics is not complicated. With Gulf oil off the table, buyers needed crude from somewhere. Russia had it. Lavrov stated it plainly in Beijing. Russia can make up for the energy deficit created by the Hormuz blockade for China and any other interested country. That offer was framed as generosity. It is better understood as leverage. Every week the strait stays closed, the cost of displeasing Moscow rises. A China more dependent on Russian pipelines is a China less willing to challenge Russia on anything: Ukraine, Arctic claims, Central Asia. The Hormuz crisis is quietly redrawing the entire architecture of the Sino-Russian relationship, without a single shot fired between them. The United States holds naval supremacy. It can sustain this blockade militarily. But the political costs are mounting in ways that do not show up in military briefings. U.S. allies in Europe and Asia were not informed before the launch of Operation Epic Fury. And now France and Italy are cutting bilateral deals with Tehran, rather than waiting for Washington. America is winning the military standoff and losing the diplomatic one simultaneously. Iran is economically battered, but geopolitically empowered in ways that were unimaginable 6 months ago. The IRGC is turning a military defeat into a diplomatic asset in real time. Every bilateral deal it signs with a flag state is a line in an informal ledger of influence. China faces short-term pain and long-term structural gain. The crisis is not driving the world away from China. It is driving the world into China's industrial arms. Russia is getting rich, full stop. The Philippines declared a state of emergency. Zimbabwe, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Vietnam face severe fuel shortages. Gulf Cooperation Council states declared a grocery supply emergency, with 70% of the region's food imports disrupted, forcing retailers to airlift basic staples. 45 million people are at risk of food insecurity by late 2026. 33 kilometers of water, billions of people affected. The math is brutal in its simplicity. Both Washington and Tehran have calculated that the cost of continuing this standoff is worth bearing, for now. Washington believes maximum pressure will bring Iran back to the nuclear table in Islamabad. Tehran believes that every day of closure costs the world enough pain that the U.S. will eventually blink. Both may be right. Both may be wrong. The problem is that while they find out, something older and harder to repair is happening underneath. The architecture of global energy, just-in-time shipping, dollar-denominated oil, free passage through international waterways as a given, is dying in real time. Not dramatically, not with a declaration. Quietly, deal by deal, one payment by one payment, bilateral agreement by bilateral agreement. The post-Cold War order was built on a set of assumptions, that choke points stayed open, that allies stayed loyal, that the dollar was how the world priced everything that mattered. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway, it is the pressure point where those assumptions are being renegotiated. And the entity doing the most careful, patient negotiating of that new reality never fired a single shot.